get started and welcome everybody, and I'll turn it over to you, Kevin. But my name is Natalie Fritz, and I am the archivist and director of outreach for the Clark County Historical Society. And we do regular virtual programs where we share topics on local history. And today this is a special one where we're working with people from CLARA, the Clark County Amateur Radio Association. They meet regularly in our building here at the Heritage Center. And we had started talking several months ago about doing some sort of partnership. So it has turned into this virtual program where we're going to turn it over to them so they can tell you more about amateur radio in Clark County. And there will be an exhibit on display in the Heritage Center lobby in the next couple of weeks. And coming up this weekend is a big event in the ham amateur radio community, field day, which they'll talk about more, which is coming up on June 24th. And they'll be demonstrating out at the farmers market from about 9 to 12 on Saturday. And then we're doing a kids workshop on July 8th. So if you haven't passed along word to people you know who have younger people between the ages of about 8 and 15 that might be interested in building their own crystal radio, and you haven't done something with that already, they might want to sign up for this program. But with all of our virtual programs, we record them and make them available later for people to watch and learn more from. So I'm hoping that those of you that are part of this club, this will be a good chance for people to be able to find information about ham radio in general and information about your club here, and all sorts of information that they'll be able to find in the future. So that'll eventually be on the Facebook page for the Heritage Center and on our YouTube channel. So it'll show up in just a general search for anybody looking for information. We found that's a good way to spread local history and to spread history information in general with people. So we're happy to partner to provide this resource in the future after tonight's event where you are going to share with us. So Kevin, I'll turn it over to you. I'll mute myself and turn off my video and let you introduce yourself and get us started with the program tonight.
Very good. Thank you, Natalie. And I'm Kevin Campman. I'm the president of Clark County Amateur Radio Association. And I'm joined here this evening by a number of our club members who have volunteered or offered to help talk about different aspects of ham radio in the community. We have quite a history in Clark County, and we want to talk about that. We also, like many organizations, want to make people aware of what we are and what we do and how that helps the community. So there's a number of different areas where we have an interest and an impact on things that happen. And so I'll be calling on these members as we go through our presentation to have to contribute their knowledge to what we're trying to inform you about. We also have some videos that we shot. We couldn't get everybody into this meeting this evening, but we felt that it was important to let you understand the depth of experience that we are dealing with in our community. So I have several people who I will be playing video clips of, and I think you'll find those enjoyable. With that, I want to reiterate what Natalie said. We have a big event this weekend called Field Day, and that's where it's a national, actually it's almost a global event where we communicate with other ham radio operators around the country and around the world. And it's sort of a party, sort of a contest, and we get together and show off our equipment, play with our equipment, look at new things. And it's something that we find very beneficial in terms of getting new ideas for things to study and learn about over the coming year. But before we start into that, let's talk about what amateur radio really is. And I'm going to call on one of our members, Natalie, are you sure you wanted to do that? Are you seeing my screen?
Is everyone seeing both screens now with can everyone see just the title screen, or are they seeing the next one?
Let me do this. Let me flip that. That's probably what you want to see.
That's what I wanted. Yeah. Sorry about that. Everybody just sees the one.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And so yes, we experimented with that earlier today, and it's always fun to try and deal with two screens. So in any event, I want to call on one of our newer hams, a gentleman named Roger Ward, who works for the Veterans Administration in Clark County. And he's our club vice president. And Roger, you're there, right?
I am here.
Unmute. There you go. He's going to talk to us about what amateur radio is and how it relates to other forms of radio communications that we all partake in. So Roger, I'll give you the floor.
Well, thank you, Kevin. As the slide indicates, and I'm assuming that the slides will be part of this, there are multiple different types of communication, radio communication, and they get broken down, and people don't really think about it in their day-to-day lives, but you have your telecommunications that we all know and love. It's how we reach out and actually, that's not been a phrase for a long time. Reach out and touch someone. I suppose I'm dating myself, and I'm a youngster to an extent. But the days of AT&T, back when it was a actual landline phone company, but telecommunications, talking about how you speak with someone just over the phone, that sort of thing. Commercial broadcasting gets a little more complicated, because it's what we think of when we think of AM and FM radio, television, but it's a little more broad. So with commercial broadcasting, you have your for-profit, if you will, broadcasters. Think of anybody that typically would have a commercial somewhere in their mix while you're listening, is going to be a for-profit type commercial broadcaster. That's going to be your typically your music stations, your talk radio stations, those sorts of things, but also your television stations as well. They are also commercial broadcasting. Then you have your public broadcasting. Locally, we have WYSO, but also you have your public broadcasting and television as well. Pardon me. And I just drew a blank. I know I'm missing one or two, but the educational broadcasting goes hand in hand with the with that aspect of it. And then we get down into the amateurs, not quite to us yet. You have Citizens Band, which is it's non-licensed in the U.S. It's intended to be low power. Some people I've heard it equated to the Wild West, because it's kind of unruly and tends to play fast and loose, and a lot of people don't pay attention to the output rules and that sort of thing.
Generally, it's unregulated in terms of what's, in terms of monitoring and so forth.
Correct. It's technically regulated with what you are supposed to be allowed as far as power output and that sort of thing, but I don't recall the last time I heard of somebody being hit by the FCC for running too much power out of their CB unit and creating problems.
Yeah, I think the FCC is more concerned about people who encroach on commercial broadcasting with
Exactly.
AM or FM stations, and people who
create problems for their neighbors.
Right.
Yeah. If you're creating problems with your amateur radio with your neighbor's Wi-Fi or your neighbor's garage door opener or anything else, then the FCC is more concerned about that. They kind of let the citizens band crowd just do their thing. GMRS, I heard a gentleman a couple of weeks back refer to it as ham light. You have to have a license for it, but you don't really have to test. It's UHF only, and you are very limited in your output. It is regulated by the FCC. And interestingly, you can, there are a very limited number of channels, and you can hit repeaters that are specifically for GMRS that will extend your range a bit, but it's nowhere near as robust as ham radio in that regard. And then you have us, amateur radio, where you have UHF, different frequency range UHF from GMRS. I need to be clear on that. UHF, VHF, and then all of these wonderful HF frequencies, all of these band ranges from 6 meter, 10 meter, 20 meters, all the way up the spectrum. And you start with your technician's license, and then you work hard and you get your general, and then you work even harder and you get your amateur extra. And as you work along, your world opens up a little more and a little more. And whereas with GMRS, like I said, you're very limited in how far you can reach out to the world. And it's literally very local. With your technician, you have some ability to talk to the world. You can definitely talk locally with other amateur operators. But once you get your general, you can hit the HF bands within your limits, and you can literally talk around the world. And then once you have your amateur extra here, as long as you pay attention to what you're doing, the world is yours to speak with. I recall at our last net, gentleman, I think he was talking about speaking with somebody in South America because the bands were working well for him. I can't remember which frequency range, but I think he said Uruguay, if I remember correctly. But you could talk all over the world. and it's an amazing thing. And
Actually, it's easy to get to South America because the gray line runs from, when it runs through Ohio, it goes right down the east coast of South America. And that gives us an extra boost in terms of reach.
right. And then, also with the ham bands, you have, with amateur radio, you have not just the ability to talk, you have the obviously Morse code. You have all sorts of different types of data transmission. There's different ways to try to message. There's Earth, Moon, Earth, or moon bounce. Yes, sending messages from the Earth to the moon and back, which is kind of a mind-blowing thought for me still. You can try to use something called Whisper, WSPR, to get the most minimal amount of power that you can and see exactly how far you can send a message, just a signal really, with it. And people send signals tens of thousands of miles that get picked up and confirmed that way. So it's really what you want to make of it. That's the beautiful thing about amateur radio, that all of those other things are not. It is something for everyone that nobody really knows about.
And I think it's interesting if you look at this from a time standpoint. We've only been in, radio's only been around for about 125 years. And when you talk about things like telecommunications and so forth, we've just moved away from landlines to cellular communications and radio. And so radio is becoming the new normal in terms of how information is exchanged. And we're seeing a lot of disruption and new technology in that area. And I think there's a lot to be considered and learned as we see that change coming about. And amateur radio is where a lot of that change is being experimented on and tested and evaluated. So some of the things that we're doing in digital are going to influence things that are going on in the commercial industry.
Oh, I agree. When we look at things like software defined radio that people are moving forward with and trying to always push the limits of, the digital aspects of radio that I can't even begin to understand, because I'm not a digital minded person. But when I hear people talking FT8 and all of these different things, I try to follow along, and I listen to the various podcasts, and they try to explain it in layman's terms, and I sit there and try to understand it as a layman. But I agree that there's so much that we're doing that, well, not me personally, but amateur radio enthusiasts and licensees are doing that will impact the future. And like I said, most people don't realize it. They just think that it's a bunch of guys talking on the radio, or using old, outdated coding, Morse code, to chat with each other.
I hope we get a chance in this conversation to dispel some of that perspective, because this is really important to how the world works. It is, the internet is relatively new. And I was in a disaster planning group with the hospitals in the region. Actually, this was several years ago. And they said, what would you do if you lost the internet? And they had little work groups, and they were trying to think about what they were going to do and how they were going to get information exchanged between the different hospitals. And I suggested, you really haven't mentioned amateur radio in this equation. And some of the work that we're doing represents setting up an internet over the airwaves, which is, maybe that's what Elon Musk is doing with Starlink, but there are other ways to do it already that can be done on the ground. And we're the ones that work out the way that is accomplished. So these ideas get tested by amateur radio operators, and you don't have to be an engineer to do it. So I think that's a very valuable element of the kind of experience that we get.
Well, I agree. Just the ability to, I think you were the first one to show me WinLink and those sorts of things to be able to send email via amateur radio. And I would have never realized that was a possibility before being licensed and going to my very first field day and sitting down and watching you work at it.
So this has been something, thank you, Roger. This has been something that has been an aspect of our community for quite some time. If you search the FCC records, which you can do, there are over 200 amateur radio operators in Clark County, not all of whom are associated with CLARA, our organization, but who are still engaged with the hobby. In fact, when we posted this announcement for this webinar, someone signed up for it that I went to grade school with. I had no idea he was an amateur radio operator, and it looks like he's been licensed since 2000. So it's quite broad in terms of what brings people to the hobby and the things that they're trying to use it for. And in order to do this information exchange that we're talking about, there have been clubs and organizations that have been around for quite some time. So I want to introduce Buzz Udy, W-A-B-U-Z, to talk about the history of clubs in the area and how they've evolved over time. So Buzz, are you there? Unmuted?
Indeed, if you can hear me, I hope I'm coming through.
Roger, your signal is great.
Well, first of all, you have listed on the page, we started out with the Springfield Amateur Radio Club and the Western Ohio Repeater Association. And I believe it was back in February of 1980, they merged and became CLARA. And obviously near us in Madison County, you have the Madison County folks, and over in Dayton, you have DARA, which sponsors Hamvention, and obviously the group up in Champaign County, which I'm not really too well knowledgeable of, but Bill Norton, who you have listed on the page there, wrote a beautiful history of Clark County amateur radio, the first 50 years. And it's really interesting in our club. Well, some minor statistics. Since I took over as treasurer in 2012, our membership stays around 45 to 50 year to year. And as Roger mentioned, he was talking about the different amateur radio classes. And our club is really fortunate. We're made up about 14, 15% of young folks with technician. And I say young in the sense of young amateur history. And then we have the folks with the general license, about 35% of the club. And finally, the advanced and amateur extra. Now, the reason I say advanced is because we have 2 members in the club, and you'll hear from one of them tonight, Glenn, that's an amateur, advanced rather, class. And then we have the extra class, and together those 2 classes make about 53% of our total. So that gives a little idea of our radio group. Now, I happen to also be a member of DARA and attend their Thursday night group, which is just a chance for everybody to make great use of their facility. And whatever project you're working on that's related to amateur radio, and sometimes they're not even related to amateur radio, you get a chance to work on. And we also have the Miami Valley P25 group, which is actually using radios that are coming out of the law enforcement and first responder community. As Roger was talking about, you have all the different types of radio. Well, this is both an analog and a digital augmented radio. And with all the stuff coming available today, for a couple $100, you can have a radio that meets the ABCO 25 or the P25 standard. And it's a digital radio, but we're in the process right now of creating towers almost identical to Mark's for the first responders, but it's all ham radio and it's all run by ham radio. And it really is interesting in the sense that these different groups throughout the community, and I look at the whole Miami Valley as really another technology landfall. You hear about Silicon Valley and you look at how things are going down in Texas. Well, amateur radio has really supported technology in the Miami Valley. And I think that's one thing that gets overlooked many, many times. Now, in preparation for tonight, I ran some statistics, or I shouldn't say I ran them, I looked them up. And by country, the country with the largest percentage of population, it's a radio amateur, is Slovenia. 32% of the population, so roughly 1 in 3 is a radio amateur. Well, that means you look at 6 people in a group and 2 of you are already radio amateurs. That's pretty darn good statistic. Japan has 30%. USA comes in third with 23%, followed by Canada 19% and Denmark 15%. But it gives you an idea of the amount of amateur radios that are throughout the world. And that was something Roger alluded to, and you did too, Kevin. In addition to that, I ran it by state just for grins and giggles, and believe it or not, the state with the most radio amateurs is California, 14%, Texas, 7%, Florida, 5.5%, Washington, 4.5%, and Ohio with 3.6%. We're the 5th in a row. The real thing that hit me, the top 10 states in the United States represent 50% of all the radio amateurs in our country. And the top 20% represent 73%, or the top 21% represent 3/4 of the amateur radios. So that gives kind of an idea of radio amateurs and radio amateur groups. Now that's both here locally and around the world and in the different states. So that kind of sums up where we are right now in radio groups.
Sure, and I think you made a really good point there, Buzz, which is if you were to take those states and line them up in terms of technology investment and growth, that you would see that there's a parallel in terms of the engineering talent and the draw on the population, because I believe there's a direct influence in terms of interest in what you can leverage
Well,
in
give you an
terms of
idea,
technology, right?
give you an idea on leveraging. We have a local group called Lunch with the Geeks, and they are kind of cross-populated with folks in what's called the Time Nuts group. Now, normally in radio amateurs, we're happy when we get to a microsecond, which is a millionth of a second. Well, these folks are a little more happy when they're at a nanosecond, which is 1,000th of a microsecond. And some of them are even happier when they get to a picosecond, which is a millionth of a microsecond. So kind of a small unit of time, but these groups help support the technology in the Miami Valley. And I think you're absolutely right. We are fortunate enough to be in a technology rich area.
Sure, and I think what goes on at the base, some of the things that they're doing with antenna technology and so forth, we don't know much about that until they come and talk to us. But there is the things that you're holding in your hand with your cell phone rely on that kind of engineering talent to be able to have an antenna that can reach all that distance to a cell tower and do it with clarity. Really does require some solid research in terms of understanding what's happening with radio frequency technologies. So and that goes back, there's a heritage there with NCR, with companies like Drake that built radio equipment in the past and so forth, that maybe we're not at the top of the curve right now, but there's still a foundation to build on. So Buzz, thanks for explaining what's happening in the group or with the radio groups. Another thing I'd like you to talk about, and I want to bring Bob Beach into this conversation if he's logged in, is who are some of the Clark County amateur radio operators that we would recognize or have some understanding of how they had an influence on the community. Buzz, you've muted yourself. There you go.
Okay, I'll back. Well, there are several folks that come to mind. I'll learn how to talk. Dick Good, W8RVH, who is now a silent key, meaning he's passed away, was very influential in what happened over at the base. He did the audio work on the B-1 bomber and was so successful on doing that work there that the B-2 bomber SPO requested him by name to do the audio work on the B-2 SPO on their airframe. And then after that, it got to the point that the C-17 SPO asked Dick Good to do the work, the audio work there. Now that didn't stop where Dick Good had an interest. He loved to do amateur TV. And I think Glenn knows about a gentleman, Townsend, over in Columbus that does amateur TV. Well, Dick Good and Townsend were close friends. In addition to that, we had Jim Bennett, K8WQE, unfortunately another silent key, that did work in the 4950th Test Wing. Well, that's where Bob Beach put a career in. And Jim Bennett ran the division that did all the video productions for the Test Wing. He ran that division and was considered a national asset in that area. Another World War II vet that was a member of the club was Milt Cole.
Mhm.
And many years ago, before he passed, why, he was the Grand Marshal out in the Fall Parade in New Carlisle. Other folks that we had in the Dayton area were Keith Marshall, a member of our club, AB8BD. Keith was the head engineer at Lard Corporation, and he, with another radio amateur up in Pennsylvania, Al Platts, built the equipment that gave Lard Corporation the ability to wind very specialized shock absorbers for the helicopter blades on the Sikorsky helicopters and for many other manufacturers. And that became quite a bread and butter thing for the Lard Corporation. In addition to that, locally, Ken Allen, KB8KE, and Jim Graver, a member of our club, these are both members of the club, KB8PSO, are both past chairs of Hamvention. And Jim, who's our past immediate president, is now heading up the amateur radio emergency service here in Clark County. So just a bunch of really good folks that all I can say is they've led the way, and I'm glad they were there.
Very good. You've got a better memory of who these folks are than I do. The names that came to mind for me, and in fact, early in this, when we were still conceptualizing having this conversation, we crossed paths with Matt Klein, who had a radio from John Westcott. John Westcott was the son of the Westcott that built the cars, and he was an amateur radio operator. And we recently donated a radio, actually it was a Hallicrafters S38 that belonged to John Westcott, to the Historic Society as an artifact of something that was used in the community. When I worked in my early career, I spent a lot of time in graphic arts when I got out of college, and I was involved in the printing industry, particularly screen printing and precision printing. And I worked at Ohio Thermometer. And at the time, I didn't have much contact with the front office, but I asked some engineers about how we might use the NCR computer there to do some plots of the graphics that we use to develop thermometer scales. And that's how I met Charlie Wapner, who was also a member of the club. His family owned Ohio Thermometer, and he was basically engaged with doing things with that computer system, which really was a business computer, not an engineering computer, but we did have a conversation about it. Another name I want to point out is Carl Miller, who has been very involved with amateur radio from an emergency management standpoint, as well as helping people who are handicapped use amateur radio as a way to express themselves and find something productive for them to do. And Carl will be talking to us later this evening. So, as I said, there's probably 200 people at any one time, and unless you see a vanity license plate or something like that, you don't know who those amateurs are, but they do have an influence on the community.
One other note, you mentioned Matt Klein, and Matt has done a wonderful video on Dick Good that's available on the internet. And I watched it the other day, and having known Dick when he was alive and everything, why, I was really appreciative that Matt was able to capture the history of Dick and World War II. It was really great.
Thank you, Buzz. And before we get away, you started talking about DARA and the influence it has on the community. Maybe you ought to mention how big Hamvention is as a convention for amateur radio operators in the community, and how that ties in with the national and international community.
Well,
You had a few points about that.
this year, fortunately for DARA, hamvention seemed to be extraordinarily successful. And for us, we're so doggone fortunate because it's down in Xenia now at the fairgrounds. And for many of us, it's a 20-mile trip when other radio amateurs are coming in from Germany and Japan and elsewhere around the world and making 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 mile journeys. And we're not even getting up to 50 miles. So it's kind of convenient for us, but it also brings in the fact that amateur radio, when they have conventions like this, or which a hamvention is really a convention of ham radio operators, we're bringing multi-million-dollar money into the community, which really helps the community. And I think in reality, it supports to the community the importance of radio amateurs. And one thing I forgot to mention earlier in the technologies, we also have a thing called mesh networks, which was developed by some engineers down in Texas. And this uses firmware that the mesh, the software, is self-healing in the sense that it looks for other transmitters and receivers. And when it finds them, it automatically links to them. And if one gets turned off, it automatically drops it. So it's really kind of early version of AI added to ham radio.
Sure. And that's the way you would replace that's one way to replace the internet if there's ever a loss of that service.
That's why it was developed.
So we actually have quite a community here of amateur radio enthusiasts, but that's part of a national and international community. We can point to our affiliation with the Amateur Radio Relay League, which started out as a message passing network and still functions in that capacity, but is also the national representation of amateurs to the federal government, to state governments and so forth, as well as a technology community. The ARRL funnels a lot of the work that we do on the ground out here into its publications. And there are organizations around the world who are peers to the ARRL, like the Radio Society of Great Britain, where we have an affinity with others who are interested in technology and the capability to communicate around the world. And I think it's really a way to tie the world together. And unfortunately, when things like the Ukraine situation came about, one of the things they put their thumb on right away was amateur radio, because we communicate freely across national borders. And so when that happened, we couldn't communicate. They couldn't communicate, they could only listen. And so that's something to be aware of as well, is that this goes beyond cellular, this goes internationally. Anything else you'd like to add, Buzz, before I turn it over to Carl Miller?
No, let Carl have it, and we'll get his perspective.
Thank you. Carl was one of the names that I mentioned on the famous names slide, but Carl and Dave Coons, who's another member of our club, WT8W, have been very involved in a group called Handy Hands. And it wasn't something I knew an awful lot about when I started with the club, but as I got to know Carl and Dave, it became very apparent to me that ham radio is something that doesn't require it offers a benefit to people who don't have all of their physical facilities. And so you tend to run into disabled people and don't even know it, because it's not a factor in their ability to deal with their peers and communicate at that level. So we put together a video of Dave Coons. He was not able to be here tonight. And I think Carl and I discussed this earlier. We'll start with that video and give you a little introduction to what Handy Hams is all about and how we got involved in it. And then I'll let Carl expand on his relationship with that as well. Natalie, to do that, I'm going to have to go back to PowerPoint because I can't play the videos from the display screen. And hopefully I can click on that and that will work. There we go.
I got involved and I did what Air Force retiring. Colonel Bob Breckman, KIUJ, lived a couple blocks. I got involved with him, and 1 year he says, I'll tell you what, you're going to be gone for about 10 days. I took off one morning with like Jordan Minnesota. What's going on out there? And I walked in and sat down, and obviously there were blind people in there. I sat down for breakfast the first morning I was there, and the guy says, "Eat your food like me. You'll be able to see better like me." Got to know people. It was called handicap camp.
So does that stand for handicap?
Handicap.
Okay.
And the idea was to help people who had disabilities get their licenses so they could be more active in their lifetime. There's a consequence. I haven't run into a bunch of the Vietnamese vets, hard-nosed guys, and we've seen everything. We had that myself in the call, all the North class, every one of the vets in our class. One of them got their license. First year we come back to camp, most of those guys were gone. Didn't see a difference for 3 years. When they finally showed us, oh, we were busy. Got tied up with vets, but doing things exactly what it was that they wanted to do. For a period of 12 years, I taught it and taught it. I remember, oh yeah. The end of summer, we go to Lake George, Minnesota for about a week, 10 days. And then in February every year we go to Los Angeles, California, up north on the Pacific Coast Highway. And a couple of children's camp. We had a camp up there, so there were 2 camps a year that I was involved in. I'm an instructor. And I did it for 12 years. The last year, 2002, I was supposed to go, but unfortunately, I broke my hip, and that kind of wiped out my career.
So Carl, are you there?
I think so. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, you sound great.
Okay.
So
This web-
tell us about Handy Hams from your point of view.
Okay, well, this webinar stuff is new, so if I goof up, please forgive me here. Interestingly, Dave Coons and Bob Beach hounded me for some time to go to Handy Ham's radio camp. Well, that meant spending a week on a daddy vacation away from the family, and I was reluctant to do it. Finally, Dara, that Dad spoke about a while ago, actually paid my camper's fee for the first time that I went up there. And all I had to pay for was the airfare to get there. So then I was obligated to write a report for the RS Carrier, which was a newspaper for the DARA organization. That sounded like a good deal. So I went up, I did my advanced class upgrade. My instructor was blind and a parole officer for LA County. Now that seemed kind of strange, but Wayne Keeney did take nothing from nobody. And I liked the man a lot, but he was very direct. Anyway, I had so much fun up there with all the other campers and the instructors that I subsequently went back several years on my own dime as a volunteer instructor. I did 3 or 4 sessions in Lake George, and I did 2 in Malibu for the spring camp that they had up there. And I can remember some interesting things on some flights and so forth, because on one of the returns from Malibu, there was bad weather in Fort Worth. So we got diverted to Chicago. We got into Chicago, there was 12 inches of snow expected there. All the airplanes were overloaded because of the weather in Fort Worth. And Dave and Bob went to the gatekeeper there at the airport. You see that guy over there were his caregivers. They didn't tell me anything about this. And he has to be in Dayton tonight, and we have to be there with him. We made the flight to Dayton, though, so their ingenuity paid off there. I wasn't too excited about flying in the weather we left Chicago in. But anyway, coming back to the experience at Handy Hams, I met a young lady up there that very first trip up. She was in high school. She was born blind, and she was already an extra class amateur. The Morse code was not my strong point. I struggled to meet the various qualifications. Catherine could make a bench or paddle smoke. I mean, she was good. Now, for those who might not know what a bench or paddle is, it's a form of a telegraph key that enables you to send Morse code via radio, frequently referred to as radio telegraph. Morse code type signals can get through bad weather when other kinds of stuff can't get through, because the bandwidth is very narrow, and it makes it through all the static crashes that are on an AM signal. So if you've got a talented, skilled Morse code operator, he can communicate with a weak signal and get through nasty weather and everything, because the tones are easily distinguishable from the static crashes that would just totally destroy voice. Now, as far as the activities up there and who you met, heavens, we met doctors, we met everybody there was handicapped. I mean, this was Handy Hams radio camp. At Lake George, it was always the last season of the year. And what they did up there was, one week it was a burn camp. Another week it was people with ALS or something like that. They categorized the various disabilities. And Handy Hams was always the last camp before they closed down for the fall and winter. And met a guy up there who was a model builder for Pontiac automobiles. It was an industrial accident that broke his neck. He was a total quadriplegic. If his hand fell out of his lap while he was in a wheelchair, he would have to ask one of his caregivers to put his hand back in his lap so the pendulous hanging of his arm wouldn't hurt his shoulder. I remember wondering, why is he doing this? He can't even operate his radio. Then I remembered some time when somebody asked me, why do you try to do this? Well, because I want a life. And I reevaluated this guy, Rob. He's trapped in a body that is almost totally non-functioning and has a cognitive mind. And he did all this from memory. He passed his test, he got his license, and after reevaluating what I thought, this was a man of great courage because he did something to keep himself from going out of his mind. I came home and joined my family that Labor Day weekend at the campsite where we had been traditionally going. Now, I have to return here briefly. I'll try not to take too long. As I was packing like a man, you know, stuff it, sit on it, zip it, and hope it doesn't explode. And while I was packing and convinced that I was alone in that cabbage, this somewhat weak voice says, "Help me. Can somebody help me?" I don't usually spook very easy, but I tell you, just for a second, I was terrified. And I walked down the hall and I couldn't believe what I was looking at. This guy who I had most of the time seen in an old-fashioned type wheelchair, like you would expect out of the 1940s, was taped like a mummy to a 2x12 board suspended between two sawhorses. He actually looked like King Tut in an Egyptian tomb. "Rob, what the heck happened?" "Carl, this is the way I sleep. They're letting me sleep late because this is a travel day and it always really tires me out." They had to load that poor guy into plane almost like a chunk of freight or something. I mean, totally helpless. And he says, "When you go down to the mess hall, please tell my caregivers that I'd like to discuss my meds." I said, "But Rob, you're here all alone. You're totally vulnerable." He got a little frustrated. He says, "Carl, this happens all the time." He says, "Just please tell my caregiver." I found myself not wanting to leave him there in that defenseless state, but yet he's used to it. It's happening. So I went and I found his caregiver, gave the message. When I got back to the campsite, I've walked on crutches and braces since I was 9 years old. I've had so many different people come to me, "Oh, you poor thing." No, don't do that to me. I'm having a life, I'm doing fine. And yet, usually these were elderly people. My mom's raising wouldn't allow me to be rude to them, but sometimes when he started heaping sympathy on me, I just want to say, "Shut up and go away." Naturally, I couldn't do that. I got in my Dodge diesel pickup truck with my 27-foot travel trailer. I was driving home. My son had hooked it up for me. Now, Nancy and I could hook it up, but it was a lot more work with my handicap and being on the crutches. So when you had a 20-something son, you go hook the thing up. So now I'm driving his rig home. I looked over at my wife. "Do we have any blue leotards?" Well, why would you do that? And I says, compared to the people that I seen up there at that radio camp, I'm Superman. Rob Mershong, I think was his name, would give anything to do what I'm doing, even at my level of handicap. And it's an image I'll never be able to forget. And never do I complain, because there's always somebody worse off. Back to the camp, the spirit of the campers up there, and I mean the clients, with all of their various handicaps, and a lot of them were pretty severe. Everybody was laughing, joking, teasing on each other. There wasn't any poor me attitude from anywhere. And Handicap Camp was probably one of my most rewarding events.
That's inspiring, Carl. And you've been if service to the community as well with the emergency services and so forth. And I'd like you and Jim to describe, Jim Ray, to describe how you've worked together on emergency services that amateur radio provides to the community and the impact that that has in support of the other community services like law enforcement and so forth that rely on us when there's a disaster.
Do you want me to continue right now?
I'll give you the mic and then I'd like to hear from Jim as well.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I was appointed to be the Amateur Radio Emergency Services Emergency Coordinator for Clark County around 1998. What are some of the things that we can do? Well, just prior to my appointment, Bob Beach was my predecessor, and Community Hospital had to have their entire telephone system ripped out and up to date when put in. Now, what do you do with a hospital without telephone communications? About 11 p.m. one night, a group of ARES members converged upon the hospital. At every nurse's station, every critical thing in the ER and everything, there was an amateur radio with a handy-talkie. The only live telephone line in the whole thing was the main line coming to the switchboard. This started at midnight. The job was completed somewhere around 6:30 to 7 o'clock a.m. when the new system came back online. And all the amateur radio operators went home and caught some sleep. But I mean, that was a service that we did for the community. In looking at some of the FCC regulation, the Communications Act in 1934 talked about having a pool of experienced radio operators for general need of the public. In some legislation that happened near the beginning of World War I, there was some other reference there, I can't quote it, but all this was a plan of having skilled radio operators, because during any major crisis, not only do you need extra communication channels, you got to have the manpower to operate them.
Right.
And that's where the amateur radio operators come in, owning their own equipment and saving the government money there. But that's how we justify the spectrum space that we have, because amateur radio has a lot of frequency privileges in different radio bands throughout the entire spectrum. And another thing that was coming in, let's see, I was appointed in 1998. That was the same year Erica Baker disappeared in Dayton. Some of us operators from Springfield went down and joined in with the DARA group to provide communications and or searching manpower to look for the child. Shortly thereafter, well, another event that happened too. I can't remember whether it was the avian flu or the swine flu. I kind of think it was the avian flu. We wanted to get everybody in the whole county vaccinated in one weekend. We set up this big operation at the fairground. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people came in. A lot of people went into the setup they had there between the women's building, the mercantile building, and that annex, and got out and came in and got their shots. We had another operation set up in one of the horse show arenas out there in the other end of the fairground. You drive in, you fill out some papers, you stick out your arm, you get a needle, and you leave. We managed to create quite a traffic problem on State Route 41 by the fairgrounds of the people flooding in and out of there. Once again, this was a community service. This was something we did to justify our spectrum space.
Mhm.
Do you remember Y2K?
Yes.
Everybody was terrified what those computers were going to do using a 2-digit year code. Went through fine. But that night we had radio operators at every township department in the county. We had radio operators at every hospital. We had radio operators at the county sheriff, and we had radio operators at Clark County EMA. And that happened at near the beginning of my tenure as the emergency coordinator. Officially, right now, I'm still the emergency coordinator, but I'm getting ready to pass the torch, so to speak, to Jim, because I'm 82 years old. We need some younger leadership. So let's bring in the youth and keep the thing going.
Absolutely.
And I sort of inherited Jim because he was an assistant EC when Beach handed it over to me. And I've known Jim for a long while. He's a very reliable operator. And I guess I can't think of too much else to say right now.
Hey, Carl. Well, listen, you got your baptism by fire, and this has been very informative. I hadn't even thought about the swine flu immunization until you mentioned it, but I remember going through that
Yeah.
traffic jam.
Can I add one additional thing before I go?
Sure, go ahead.
There's a lot of talk these days about the incident command system of managing emergencies. This is relatively new, and it came from California in the forest fires. Another thing that was happening quite a bit during my the early part of my tenure was there was a lot of FEMA grant money around, and everybody was being shotgunned, if you will, through these ICS courses, because the more people you got that was working for EMA in the various places, the more grant money FEMA could give you for further training. And we went through an awful lot of those too. At that time, Amateur Radio League had up there created 3-course emergency communications. I took all 3 of those. Presumably, I'm trained through ICS 400, which is kind of high. And I went through that so fast, I could never operate on that level because I can't remember enough of it. But on the other hand, I couldn't operate even if I was trained unless I was officially on the payroll of the county government. Just because I know what's going on, my name, my signature has no authority unless I am part of the government, and being a volunteer does not give me the privilege to behave in that capacity. So I think it's about time for me to pass it on to Jim.
Jim, are you there?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Well, just to add on to what Carl was talking of, Amateur Radio Emergency Services is the support function of amateur radio to the what we call the served agencies, whether it be the Emergency Management Agency or the Red Cross or the county sheriff's department or whatever. We provide communication support at their request. We don't respond on on our own. We have to wait until we're asked to come and participate. A lot of the earlier days before the first responders got the radio system that they do now, they couldn't talk to each other. The fire department couldn't talk to the police department couldn't talk to the sheriff's department. So there was a few instances where they called us and we could shadow the incident commander and the fire chief and the EMS commander and provide communications between all of them. Intercommunications was something that was lacking, and we filled that void. But other than that, we do provide weather spotting for the National Weather Service down in Dayton. Or actually, we report through Dayton. They're in Wilmington. We have a group of net operators that bring up a weather net on the repeaters, our local repeaters, and have our people out there looking for any of the observables that the National Weather Service wants to know about, whether it's what size of hail is falling or how many trees are falling down. We're the eyeballs for the National Weather Service in Wilmington. So that's that about sums it up, and I'll turn it back to you, Ken.
Thank you, Jim. I appreciate your stepping in, and I guess this is news to me that you're going to step in behind Carl, but I know you've been working well together for quite some time. So one of the things that you've heard people talk about on this presentation so far is Morse code. And Morse code is a part of the technology that actually was the foundation for amateur radio. We started out using continuous wave, which is what Morse code uses, to use something called a spark gap transmitter, which we will have a display unit of down at the historical museum that's on loan to us from the Westcott House. But that series of dots and dashes is something that all of us had to learn in the past. Now it's optional, but it made up the foundation for amateur radio in the early days. And some of us are still practitioners. That's in comparison to voice communications, which is where you see technologies like amplitude modulation, frequency modulation, and something that's unique to much of the communications we do, something called single sideband. So I'm going to play another clip from Dave Coons where he talks about Morse code, and then I'm going to let Ralph Paymer. Ralph, are you on the line?
Yeah, I'm here, Kevin.
Okay, let's hear from Dave, and then I know you like Morse code, and I'd like to give you a chance to weigh in on why it's of interest to you now. So I'm going to stop the presentation and play this little clip from Dave.
Morse code started back in the 40s. Broadcast from the ship. And it was the only way for a long time. People were able to use voice because radios weren't that sophisticated. But we were able to use continuous wave as a way to signal over the air. Now, so said you can do this really fast. I don't want to do it fast. I have no problem with that. But why don't you say? Thank you. Actually, anybody my call. Here's my call. I had called. My third or fourth call started out. My call had a 10 in it for novice, and I got it with the higher class license and technician in general, and that was time. And now of course my call is WTA. That's the class license I applied for. When I retired from my job, I think it's not broken because I was fine. I'm retired.
So Ralph, I know you're quite interested in Morse code as well. Why don't you talk to us about the discipline?
Okay, Kevin. Well, thanks for having me on tonight. Morse code, yeah, that started it all. It used to be a requirement. This year will be 60 years I've had a ham radio license. And when I first started, I stayed a technician because I didn't get past 5 word a minute on Morse code. And finally, I got my 13 word a minute. And it's just like a few other things. If you get to like it, then you're in trouble. So I got to liking it. And it's a great mode. I think a lot of guys are really missing out in not operating CW. I'm not the fastest CW operator by any means, and I'm really not that fast. And at my age, it's a little bit tough to get any faster with it. I would like to. They call it copy in your head. And I'm not doing really fast at that, but I enjoy getting on the air. I enjoy working many different countries in the world. And I enjoy what I call a QSO, which is a conversation with hams all over the world. And you know, for young people, this is easy for you to learn. When you get old, your brain kind of slows down, but young folks can pick this up real easy. And touching on a little bit what Carl said, you know, you never know who's on the other end of the key. And sometimes it'll be a handicapped person and they can't send code real good, but it's the operators that take the time to work these slower folks that really makes the hobby great. I know I've had some experiences where I've worked, one that comes to mind right now was a young lady, was down south somewhere, and it was her first CW contact. And she wasn't very good, you know, yet, wasn't very fast, but I took the time to make a contact with her and talk with her a little bit. So I sent her a QSL card because it was her first contact. A QSL card is a confirmation of the contact, and a lot of people used to send them out quite a bit, and I have a nice collection of those, which is kind of went by the wayside. But there's still some guys that and gals that send out the QSL cards. So to get my train of thought back in here, amateur radio has so many different facets that it's amazing all the new technology that has happened over the 60 years that I've been a ham. But I still love CW. Like I say, I'm not the fastest. I do work a little bit of single sideband, but not too much. And it's just great to have a conversation where you can actually at least get a guy's name, where he lives, what equipment he has, and so forth. With a lot of foreign hams, you can't really communicate too much because it's hard for them to send it in English. But it's a great hobby, and I encourage young folks and any other ham to go ahead and try CW, and you'll find it's a terrific mode, and I'm stuck on it. I guess I'm just stuck in the mud here, but I love it. I'm like a hog in mud, I guess.
Well, I know that, Ralph, and if you think of it like music, it really does have that quality of being able to translate those dots and dashes into a note, and that's really how you have to think about it if you want to get good at it.
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways to learn it, and of course, when I learned it the wrong way, and then you got to relearn it, or I had to. But some of the young hams will just burn it up. Now I can't copy them because they're so good at it.
Well, it's good to know that those folks are out there. So
Yeah.
thanks for your insights there, Ralph. We're going to move on to the non-Morse code side of ham radio. I'd like to introduce Glenn McConkey, who is on our technical committee, or chairs our technical committee, and is very interested in digital technology, to talk about that. And also Carl Miller, who likes to communicate digitally with his friends. So Glenn, are you there?
Yes, I am, Kevin. Can you hear me?
Yes. So the floor is yours.
All right, Kevin. I was just thinking here, when ham radio operators started bringing their personal computer into the ham shack, maybe 35, 40 years ago. Seems like a long time ago, but anyways. So they looked at the computer on their left side, look at the amateur radio set on the right side, and they say, well, we got to bring these two together for digital communications. And this is the list here that you have shown is some of those various modes that have been created here over the decades. One of the first one there, the PSK 31, which is phase shift keying, that's still very popular yet today. I know as you tune across the HF frequencies, you hear stations on there that are still using the PSK 31. I think Roger Ward there mentioned earlier about Whisper, which is a weak signal propagation reporting. And this is kind of an interesting mode. It gets a lot of enthusiasm from amateur radio operators who operate what's known as QRP, which is a Q code for low power. But we're talking about some amateurs who are actually running just a few milliwatts of RF from their transmitter into their antenna. They send this Whisper signal out over the air. Across the world, there's literally thousands of amateurs who are listening to these preset frequencies that are used by Whisper. And if they hear their signal, they feed the information back into a collection point, and it's displayed on a map of the various amateurs that they hear using the Whisper mode. And these different stations are displayed on a map there, and it's very interesting mode of operation. It's not per se a chat program, but it's used for propagation analysis, maybe switching between different antennas and determining which antenna is the best one to use. So it's a very narrow band, very narrow band. We're talking something less than 50 hertz, if that, on the transmission path. Another mode is APRS. That is your automatic packet reporting system. Once again, when you operate this mode, you also have GPS signals that are received, which are intertwined with the APRS signal. And it's used for location of people, or you can put an APRS system in your car. As you're driving down the road, your APS or APRS transmitter is transmitting your location that's shown on a map that people can go to on their computer. And not only does it show you driving down the road, but in some cases, it actually shows you your speed that you're traveling. And I know there's a couple of amateurs here in the club that have been called out on that for going down the road too fast. So it's a very interesting system to use. System fusion. This is something that's a term that was created by Yaesu, which is one of the three major manufacturers of amateur radio equipment. System fusion is a system that uses not only be used for digital voice, but also digital data. Use either a VHF radio or a UHF type radio. And of course, to extend that signal, you're sending this data through a repeater. And that gives you, of course, a much greater range by using your mobile radio or even your handheld radio, transmitting this digital data called fusion through a repeater. So that's another system that's available for the amateurs to use. DMR, digital mobile radio. This was something that was created, it's a standard that was created by the European Telecommunications Institute many, many years ago. And once again, it's just a standard of communications that we as amateurs in the United States use, not only in mobile radios, but also handheld radios. P2, or also referred to as P25, we mentioned this earlier. The main word that comes to mind on the P25 standards and interoperability. I know someone mentioned earlier about, I think Jim Ray mentioned this, you have your public service folks, such as the fire department, they can talk to other units that under the fire department umbrella. You got the police, they're able to talk to other folks who are under the police force. But one of the problems they have is being able to talk between the different agencies. There is situations which the police need to talk to the fire department. So this was a standard, this P25 standard came out shortly after the devastation of the Twin Towers in New York. And that's what created this particular standard there. VARA is a new digital mode that's come out. This is a modem. Once again, it's software that's loaded onto the computer. It is what's referred to as a adaptive modem. In other words, depending on the band conditions, it actually varies the speed of the data. If you got extremely weak signals, you may only have data going at about 18 bits per second. But if you got an exceptionally good path, then you're talking about data speeds of 2,500 to 3,000 bits per second. And along with the VARA modem, there's what's called a VAR-AC. That is a chat program that you put on the computer. You use it for calling out CQs. You can exchange emails, messages between stations. And it's just another It's just another digital mode that's been available for the amateur radio operators to use. And this list shown here that were items that we've covered, it's just a very small list. If you go to what's a software package called FL Digi, there's probably 24 different digital modes that you can use with your amateur radio system. So that's a little bit of information there on the digital modes. And it's not only do some of these digital modes strictly use information from the computer, but also some of these digital modes are also using the voice, especially System Fusion, the DMR, and what have you there. So there you go, Kevin.
Thank you, Glenn. Appreciate the oversight of that. Like to ask Carl one quick question. Carl, are you there? Are you on mute? Well, I know Carl's favorite mode is System Fusion. He talks to his friends basically around the country over that network. And that is really growing in terms of the ability for people in the lower license classes to get what we call distance communications or DX communications. So we're using digital as a way to expand the capabilities of amateur radio and making it more flexible and useful to people who are getting started. Our next slide talks to something that's called radio sport and long distance communication. And this is another aspect of amateur radio to keep it interesting to people who have different interests and use radios to add to the fun of what's going on. There's a number of different areas where this is being done. Ken, are you on the call today? Doesn't look like Ken's there. How about Bob? Our DXers must be on the radios, and that's okay. But let me talk quickly about some of the things that are going on. We have national parks, not only in the United States, but around the world that have been enumerated with a number, and people will go to those parks, set up their radio, and just call for signals. And they can get credit for getting so many contacts from that park. And there are people who compete to do that. We do that for working all states. We do it for working different summits. There are mountains that are also numbered. There are islands around the world that are identified this way. And people compete to get to communicate with those different locations. We have contests like Field Day, where we try and make as many qualified contacts as we can. There are stations in the Antarctic and at the North Pole that you can communicate with. One of my favorite QSL cards is from the Antarctic station, where one of our local members got his ham license and started communicating from there. So you get a sense of accomplishment just by using the radio around the world to, if you will, flex your communication skills. And this is worldwide. It's not just in the United States. I do know that Bill Blake is on the call, and I'd like Bill to talk about the work he does with the Scouts in amateur radio. Bill?
Kevin? Before you get to Bill, can I add something real quick?
Sure.
My apologies, but I just wanted to mention that in addition to national parks, there are state parks on that, and that it is not just the people in the parks that are doing the activating. You also have the hunters who are at their home radios who are involved as well. So it's not just the people out and about, it's people at their home stations as well. Back to you.
Mhm.
It's cool. Yes, I'm Bill Blake. Call sign KD8RLB. So I'm a scout leader for Scouts BSA Troop number 1. We're a centennial troop, 100 years, along with our local council, Tecumseh Council. So I'm a scoutmaster with the troop. Under BSA, Boy Scouts of America, there's multiple youth groups. You may have heard of, you haven't heard of this, you may have heard of Cub Scouting. Cub Scouting's for younger kids, kindergarten to I think fifth grade, and then Scouts BSA, which I'm a unit leader for, is for 6th grade to 18, and then there's other groups too venturing and venturing as well. So, but in scouting and amateur radio, Scouts BSA. They primarily work on merit badges. If you're not familiar with merit badges, in Scouts, merit badge is the purpose of a merit badge is so that Scouts can examine subjects to determine if they would like to pursue them as a career. So if you don't already know, Googled it earlier. There's 138 merit badges as of 2022. So. To reach Eagle, you gotta have so many you gotta have all the Eagle requireds. Some of them are optional. You can pick a choice of them, and then most of them are elective. So the ones that are listed on the merit badges that are here, radio and electronics, I think public speaking, those may be electives. So the radio merit badge is. The merit badges are like classes, so you go over the classes with the Scouts and see if they're interested in it, and then they fulfill the requirements to get the merit badge. So with radio merit badge, I go over topics like the radio spectrum. You may have heard earlier HF and VHF and UHF. So it goes over the radio spectrum and what call signs are, like mine KD8RLB. That's a call sign. It goes over topics like, well, I mentioned the radio spectrum, how information is transmitted, like voice, like on an earlier slide, we talked about voice, either AM or FM or single sideband. We kind of talk about that. And specifically, most every merit badge in Scouts has a safety part of it and a career, so career and safety. So we talk about the career choices for that merit badge. Now the electronics merit badge is kind of the reciprocal of that. It gets into it goes over electronic components and circuit boards and how to solder and desolder components. So it kind of gets into the electronics of radio. And with electronics, it doesn't necessarily have to be radio. It can be like digital as well. So, and then there's career opportunities and of course safety with that as well. So, in the communications and public speaking merit badges, those requirements are where the Scouts can track their communication activities. Like talking in person, listening to the radio, watching TV. Amateur radio kind of helps Scouts with their communication skills. So amateur radio actually helps out with a lot of those items in those merit badges.
And there was a legacy merit badge I got back when I was a Scout.
Yeah.
Called signaling.
Right.
Involved Morse code and semaphore and so forth, and they bring that back once in a while.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So there is a place for that.
Yeah. But yeah, we get into a lot of those merit badges, and that's kind of an overview with those. So Jamboree on the Air is cool. That is a yearly event. It's the largest scouting event in the world. It's held annually on the third weekend in October every year. This year is going to be the 66th annual. So and it's going to be done on October 20th through the 22nd. So JODA, it's Jamboree on the Air. The acronym for that is JODA. It uses amateur radio to link Scouts and hams around the world around the nation, within the community. Our local council, Tecumseh Council, schedules a Cub Scout event that's for the younger scouts, and it's called Spookery. It's a Halloween event that's done down at Camp Birch in Yellow Springs. And it's scheduled. What's kind of nice about it, it's scheduled on top of the Jamboree on the Air weekend. So we set up a station at Jamboree on the Air, and the Cub Scouts get a chance to talk on the air. If we can find, a lot of times we can find another station, they can talk to other scouts, like in a different country or in a different state, which is cool. So some other activities we do at Jamboree on the Air is direction finding. So we kind of, what that is a radio is hidden, and then we show them a directional antenna and how to locate a radio. So that's there's other sporting events that in addition that can be done with that as well. So field day is another way that scouts can interact with amateur radio. They can see different radio installations or participate in direction finding activities as well.
Sure.
Yeah, there was something else not on the slide. In Scouts, there's a Nova STEM, and as part of the Nova STEM requirements, it's optional for Scouts. They can take and understand radio. So radio is part of the math. If you know science, technology, engineering, and math, radio is part of the math. Is part of the math part of STEM. So, yeah. So that's it in a nutshell. So,
Yeah, there's something there for everybody.
Yeah.
So, well, thanks, Bill. We were going to talk about something that the club did. One of the things we did that was a major event was to take one of our radio station or repeater installations and take that off the grid. And the reason we did that was financial, as well as from the standpoint of reliability and engineering expertise. And so we converted that station, that repeater station, to solar panels. And that generates enough power to operate the station. And we documented it in such a way that the national organization published an article about it that we wrote in their national magazine. And that magazine article generated inquiries from Hawaii, Alaska, the East Coast, the West Coast, the Midwest. Lots of questions being asked about how to make that conversion to solar. And we drew on the engineering expertise of a number of different members to put something like that together. Phil Wolf, we put together some video of the solar installation. Unfortunately, we're going to run out of time, but we will make that available through the Historical Society so that people can see what Phil talked about and how we actually accomplished that. I want to go back to Buzz Udy to talk about how to become a ham. I think that's very important to those of you who are on the call who aren't ham radio operators, and what it takes to get started and what kind of resources are available. So Buzz, the floor is yours. And you might be on mute. So maybe we've lost Buzz.
No, I'm here.
Oh, there you go. Okay, Buzz, it's yours.
The mouse and I weren't cooperating. At any rate, we talked earlier about the 3 classes of license: the technical, the general, and the extra. I'd like to zero in on how to get there. And we do testing at the EMA Emergency Center on the even numbered months, second Saturday at 10 o'clock. Now, in order to get ready for a test, there's gobs of books. The ARRL and others publish books. There's a lot of online things you can do, qrz.com. There's an organization called hamstudy.org and the Gordon West series. And I want to keep this short. There are also numerous podcasts that are available on the ARRL site and also numerous YouTube. You can get on YouTube and there are so many different presentations to teach you how to become a radio amateur. It's unbelievable. So we have a great group of volunteer examiners. I happen to be the liaison with the ARRL, and I also help out with Pickaway County on their testing. But if you're interested in taking a test to become a radio amateur, you can get on the ARRL site and actually look up testing and find something close to your zip code at a time you can make it. And I know we're pressed for time, so I'll stop right there.
Thank you, Buzz. And you can also find information about testing on our site, which is w8olivergolf.org. And that's our local website, which has information not only about our local club, but the affiliations we have with the national organizations. So with that, we are actually over time, and it's just a great topic to talk about. If you stayed with us and have questions, we'll be happy to stay on and take questions to make sure that you get the information you need. Otherwise, there may be a limit to wrapping this up, but raise your hand. Let's see if we have left anything on the table that needs to be addressed. Just go off mute and we'll take it.
I have a couple questions.
Go ahead, Natalie.
Do you guys all know each other by your call signs? Like you have them memorized? That's how.
Yes.
Yeah.
We get to the point where we know people by call signs.
And I have a question for you, Kevin. Do you have any of those QSL cards that we might be able to include in the display that you can loan? Because those sound really cool.
That is something I'm in the back of my car. Glenn McConkey put together a display of probably about 50 or so QSL cards that he's collected over time from around the world. And we will have that at our session on Saturday morning at the farmers market.
Okay.
Yeah, we have a display that we're going to set up along with some information. We will have an operating station there. One of our members, Rachel Ward, will be operating as part of Field Day, letting people talk on the radio, and Roger will be helping with that as well. So we will be at the farmers market. We will have information. We'll have books that you can examine for licensing and some of the technical information that we're interested in. And we'll make that available for the exhibit as well.
Okay. And I was thinking, if anything, I was going to make, I could take a picture of what you have and we can have that as one of the graphics in the exhibit, because I think that's really neat. I mean, so they're just postcards basically that they physically send you to let you, that's a really cool thing to collect.
Yes. We actually, it's fallen out of favor. We've gone electronically, and I think that's a bad thing.
Yeah, because it's cool to get mail, because no one sends mail anymore. So, and then I had another question about, what a repeater is exactly.
What is a repeater? Well, that was in the video that Phil and I recorded, but a repeater is it's exactly that. These little HTs that people, handy talkies that people carry around on their belt, only have so much power, usually no more than 5 watts. which is not a lot. And the frequencies that they operate on are line of sight. So the signal has to be within sight of the other radio or the repeater tower in order to be heard. And so what the repeater does is it gives you because the tower is higher, generally, it gives you a station that can hear you and then return or repeat that signal so that others can hear you. So a repeater is exactly that. It takes your signal and broadcasts it over a wider area. Now, there's some interesting elements to that. There is a repeater on the space station. And if you have a handy-talkie, the line of sight to the ISS is there. You can see it go over, and you can talk to it. And there is a whole education program sponsored by NASA and the ARRL so that school children can talk to the ISS, and you can use that repeater to talk basically about half the world if you can get to that repeater. So you can talk to Japan from Ohio using 5 watts.
Wow.
So that's the benefit of a repeater, is to give you distance.
So if not for the repeaters that you guys have put up or control in Clark County, you guys would not be able to communicate.
Not on those frequencies.
Okay.
It would be line of sight. And so our repeater gives us, we actually test those repeaters, and they're situated such that we have coverage of Clark County, and in fact, to Dayton and Piqua that I've tested. And on a good day, you can get further. So we can hit a circle probably about 25 miles with our repeaters. Is that right, Glenn?
Yeah, that is correct there, Kevin. And one of the other things about the repeater, Kevin mentioned earlier, like a handheld radio only being 5 watts. A repeater is typically 80 to 100 watts. So not only do you have a high antenna that's going to give you a much greater coverage area, but it's got a lot more power on that site. So that's the advantage of using repeaters. So if you go handheld to handheld, maybe 1 to 2, 3 miles at most, but with the repeater, like Kevin says, easily 25-mile radius.
You might want to add that we also do a regular simplex net, which is without repeaters, and we have some reasonable county coverage that way, but that's nowhere near what we get with the repeaters.
That's a great point, Roger. And what it's done for us as a club is that shows us what we could do without the repeaters, but it also gives you a sense for the terrain in the county, because we can tell that you can't get over certain high spots in the county because they're there. So people can talk to people on one side of the ridge or on the other side that they can't get over the ridge. And that's where the repeater really comes into play.
So I have another question. I know you guys meet here on what, the 3rd Monday?
Yes.
Is that something that people can come without, talk to you guys, come to those meetings if they're interested in getting
Absolutely.
in? Okay.
Absolutely. We're open to the public. We're very interested in seeding the interest and supporting people who want to learn more about this.
Okay, we'll make sure that we have that very, very clearly in the exhibit, how to connect with you guys and how to meet you if they want to come check it out.
Right. I printed out a whole stack of information sheets on how you can do that.
Great. We'll have those out for people to pick up too then.
Yes.
So.
Right.
So yeah, spread the word to people that you want. I know that now we've got left on the group here a lot of people from the club. So spread the word to your friends and family that the exhibit will be up. It should be fully up by the time we have the kids workshop on July 8th. So if you know any kids that are interested, spread the word to them that they can join the workshop. That'll be $25, and that will give them all the supplies to build their own crystal radio. And then, people will be able to come here and learn more and be able to figure out how to connect with you guys if they're interested. So hopefully we'll get you some more future ham radio operators.
Excellent.
Great.
And we really do appreciate the support, Natalie. This is great.
Great.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
I may be reaching out to you guys the next couple, as we get the rest of the panels together for the exhibit to make sure we've got the information correct and everything, but we appreciate you guys being here tonight, sharing more information about everything. And thank you, Kevin.
Thank you, Natalie.
So,
And thanks everybody who participated and attended.
thank you guys. Have a great night.
My pleasure.
You
Have a
too.
good night.
Thanks.
Goodbye.
Bye.